All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for joining us tonight for our spring webinar. I'm joined by Grant Quertermous, our curator and director of collections, who's going to present now on his lecture, Following in Phyfe's Footsteps, Classical Revival Furniture of Late 19th Century New York. The Q&A section is open. You're welcome to type your questions in there, and we will answer them as time allows at the end. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Grant.
Thank you, Joe, and welcome everyone. I'm going to get things started here and get my screen set up and in presentation mode to share here. And actually, I'm going to turn my camera off too, so I'm not distracting everybody gesticulating wildly in the foreground. And I hit the wrong button here. Excuse me just a second. I'm having a bit of technical difficulties. Okay, second time's the charm. At first glance, this chair looks like something produced in Duncan Phyfe's New York shop at the apex of his popularity. It has all the characteristics of Phyfe furniture from this time period: side-mounted Grecian crosses, a turned boss, and well-executed carving on the crest. It's almost identical to other Phyfe examples, but as you probably guessed, based on my topic this evening, this isn't a Phyfe chair, but rather one made by Ernest Hagen and Matthew Meier, a pair of German-American cabinet makers active in New York in the late 19th century. Tonight, I'm going to focus on their work as later 19th century cabinet makers who followed in Phyfe's footsteps and used them as a lens to discuss the popularity of classical revival furniture and how their work relates to the emerging colonial revival movement during that time. They successfully reproduced pieces in the Phyfe style, getting their start repairing and supplementing Phyfe furniture, but this wasn't until the 1880s, when both had been working as cabinet makers for more than 35 years. Their client list reads like a who's who of Gilded Age New York, and in many cases they were working for clients who were sometimes 2 or 3 generations removed from the same family as the individuals who commissioned the Phyfe furniture. The examples of Hagen and Meier's furniture that we have in our collection, 2 groups of chairs, are just as interesting as the Phyfe originals. Like the old adage says, imitation is the best form of flattery. The chair I showed you at the onset of my lecture is part of an 1882 commission from Frederick Bronson to copy original Phyfe pieces that his grandfather had purchased in the early 19th century directly from Phyfe. It's one of 4 from a larger suite that Mr. Jenrette acquired at Christie's in 1986 that's now displayed here in the drawing room at Edgewater. As I've detailed in previous lectures, our collection of Duncan Phyfe furniture is encyclopedic. We have examples from the beginning of Phyfe's career through the midpoint in the 1820s with the pieces now at Edgewater commissioned by Robert Donaldson, all the way through to the final stylistic phase, the Grecian plain style of the 1840s, that's defined by the furniture commissioned for Milford. Starting in the 1970s, Mr. Jenrette made classical New York furniture, especially pieces from Phyfe's shop, the focus of his collecting efforts, because he felt that it represented the final flowering of hand-carved furniture before the Industrial Revolution. While these chairs are not Phyfe originals, they were clearly made by a pair of cabinet makers who also had a deep appreciation for Phyfe's craftsmanship and artistry. Tonight, our story starts in the Lower East Side shop of German immigrant cabinet makers Ernest Krieg and Augustus Dorman, located at 106 Norfolk Street. This was the shop where both Ernest Hagen and Matthew Meier got their start. Previous scholars have suggested that they met in Charles Badawin's shop, but census records and Hagen's memoirs confirm that it was at Krieg and Dorman. The shop was in an area of the Lower East Side known as Little Germany or Kleindeutschland. Like many cabinet makers in that neighborhood, Krieg and Dorman made furniture for low-end furniture stores located along the Bowery and Chatham Square. In 1845, 15-year-old Ernest Hagen was indentured to the cabinet makers by his father. Late in life, Hagen penned a memoir about his experiences, including his time in the shop, that provides a fascinating insight into his training and career as both a German immigrant and cabinet maker in mid-19th century New York. And I should say that that manuscript is now part of the collection at Winterthur. Ernst Ferdinand Hagen, Ernst Ferdinand Hagen, later anglicized to Ernest, was born in the port city of Hamburg, Germany in the fall of 1830. When he was 13, Ernst and his family immigrated to the United States. In the early 1840s, Germany was undergoing a period of economic hardship and political unrest that resulted in a revolution several years later. Sailing from Hamburg in early May of 1844, Hagen later recalled the 47-day transatlantic passage in a small German-American sailing vessel that brought the family to America. The ship docked in New York on June 24th of 1844. Here you can see Ernst on the manifest of steerage passengers aboard the ship, as well as his father, a shoemaker by trade, as well as 4 siblings. The absence of Hagen's mother on the ship's manifest suggests that maybe his father was a recent widower, as his youngest sibling was just a year old. Hagen and his family were among the hundreds of thousands of German immigrants arriving in New York in the 1840s. Within a decade after Hagen's arrival, New York had the 3rd largest German population of any city in the world, eclipsed only by Berlin and Vienna. Many of the German immigrants were skilled workers in the urban craft trades, baking, carpentry, cabinet making, and needlework, all in-demand trades in mid-19th century New York. Settling in areas like Little Germany, seen here in orange, they retained many aspects of their German culture, including beer gardens, libraries, sporting clubs, German language newspapers, and houses of worship that were all in this area. In 1845, Hagen began that apprenticeship in Krieg and Dorman's shop. He continued in their employ after the end of his indenture, as he's living above the shop with the cabinet makers at the time the 1850 census is enumerated. You can also see Matthew Meier and his wife just below. And this is a good time to point out that most of the shops in the neighborhood followed this model with both living space and shop space in the same building. Hagen became a naturalized U.S. citizen in 1851 and remained in the shop until 1853. After working for several cabinet shops on Broadway, he was hired by Charles Badawin, one of the most talented mid-19th century cabinet makers in New York. Badawin employed more than 70 cabinet makers in his shop, located at 335 Broadway, where he advertised that he kept, quote, constantly on hand, the largest assortment of elegant furniture to be found in the United States. Later in life, Hagen classified the pieces produced in the shop as, quote, gaudy, over-ornate carved rosewood furniture. After Badawin closed his shop in 1855, Hagen headed west, seeking employment in Milwaukee and St. Louis, both cities with sizable German populations. Then he headed down the Mississippi to New Orleans, where he worked for Sampson and Keene, who retailed New York-made furniture in the city. They in turn sent Hagen to the St. Charles Hotel, where he spent the winter repairing furniture. He returned to New York via Havana in the spring of 1858. 3 years after leaving New York, Hagen is back in the city, where he and Matthew Meier enter into their partnership under the name Meier and Hagen. Less is known about Meier's background. About 8 years older than Hagen, Meier was born in Bavaria in 1822. He arrives in the United States sometime between 1845 and 1848, becoming a naturalized citizen himself in 1849. He and his wife are living at 160 Norfolk Street by 1850, and they have 2 children by the time of the 1855 state census. Hagen notes that he and Meier bought out their old employer, Augustus Dorman, retaining the former Norfolk Street shop. And by the time of the 1860 census, the Meiers are still living there, along with Hagen, who is not yet married, listed as head of the household. Much of Meier and Hagen's work at this time was supplying stock for New York furniture stores. They're also copying pieces from other cabinet makers in the city, and they found really limited success, as most New York retailers wanted to sell cheaper factory-made furniture shipped in from Midwestern cities like Grand Rapids instead of locally made pieces. As Hagen later wrote, quote, factory work wiped out the smaller cabinet makers, and he held nothing but contempt for the Grand Rapids Furniture Company. In 1864, Hagen married Marguerite Korber, a native of Baden, Germany, and their first child, a daughter, was born the next year. In 1867, Meier, Hagen, and their families moved further uptown, purchasing property and building a shop and residence on East 26th Street, where they would work for the rest of their lives. I suspect there were several reasons for the move. Their growing families required more space, and for the past 9 years, they'd been working in Cregan Dorman's former shop, and a newly constructed shop could be customized to better suit their needs. I'm sure the move was also in response to the changing Lower East Side neighborhood where they lived and worked. By the 1860s, Little Germany was starting to shrink as second-generation German Americans move away and settle in other boroughs. Real estate speculators also began to move in and subdivide and alter the neighborhood's row houses into densely occupied tenements. For context, 106 Norfolk was located on a block between Delancey and Rivington Streets, just 3 blocks from the building at 97 Orchard Street that's now the Tenement Museum. A demographic shift also occurred as large numbers of Eastern European, Italian, and Russian immigrants moved into the neighborhood. Meier and Hagen's new shop at 213 East 26th also placed them in closer proximity to what was becoming an important retail district, kind of roughly highlighted here in yellow, and the shop is pointed to by the red arrow. The district ran several blocks in each direction, east and west, from Union Square, heading north up toward Madison Square. This was, of course, where some of the first city's department stores were located, along with other high-end retailers. The move also placed the partners in closer proximity to the clients they were hoping to cultivate. Hagen and his growing family lived above the shop. Meier, his wife, and children lived in the building next door at number 211. As Hagen wrote, they found success after creating a specialty extension dining table that he says was better than those on the market, which was well received and led to a private trade among some of the old New York families. Another area in which the partners started to find success was in repairing antique furniture. William Hibbard, the president of the Bowery Fire Insurance Company, called upon them to repair some mahogany chairs that were damaged in a fire. Their work was well received and led to additional commissions from the Winthrop, Chandler, Roosevelt, and Havermeyer families. They also began to retail antique pieces and copy antique pieces. Their surviving account books indicate that they didn't hesitate to improve an antique piece as well, such as one 18th century fall front desk, where the entry notes that they added shell carving to the fallboard and replaced the feet with fancier ball and claw feet. They may have also repurposed half-century-old mahogany and rosewood lumber from damaged pieces of furniture for their new creations. However, in their account books, they are careful to draw a distinction between what was an actual antique and what was a reproduction or a copy. Extant labeled pieces show their versatility as cabinet makers, especially in their adaptation of specific forms of early American furniture. Meier and Hagen were also in business during a time when there was a growing fascination with the material culture of America's past. People began to collect and decorate with antiques as well as reproductions of antique furniture, one expression of what is known today as the Colonial Revival movement. The celebration of the United States centennial occurred in 1876. That same year, more than 10 million people attended the Centennial Exposition in Philadelphia. One popular attraction at the exposition was the Old New England farmhouse, with costumed interpreters, a spinning wheel, and where they demonstrated details of old-fashioned domesticity. Historical objects, including furniture that was associated with Mayflower passengers and colonial patriots, was also featured as physical relics of this Anglo-centric past. Now, there were several factors responsible for the rise of the Colonial Revival movement in the United States at that time. It arose from a genuine nostalgia for the colonial American past, but it also came about as a response to what was an era of change, rapid modernization and industrialization, as well as a fear about the influx of migrants arriving on American shores. And of course, one way to promote that idealized American past was through decorative arts and the built environment. Now, I could spend an entire lecture focused on the origins of the Colonial Revival, but I'll just say that it resulted in a newfound interest in antique objects. 17th and 18th century American furniture was pulled down from attics, and new furniture imitated those earlier styles. And as you can see, Hagen certainly was part of that trend. There are a number of extant great Colonial Revival pieces that bear his label. Ernest Hagen later recalled that his introduction to Phyfe furniture occurred in 1882, when Sarah Gracie Bronson hired him to copy a suite of Phyfe dining room chairs that her great-grandfather, Colonel Robert Troup, commissioned from Phyfe for his daughter, Louisa, who was Mrs. Bronson's great-aunt. Hagen visited Louisa Troup, who was then 91 years old, at her Fifth Avenue residence overlooking Madison Square, so he could examine the chairs, and he wrote that she, quote, told him all about Phyfe and his work. Hagen would have also seen pieces of the extensive and phenomenal Brinkerhoff suite that Mrs. Troup inherited from her sister a decade before. Louisa's sister was Charlotte Brinkerhoff, who, with her husband James, commissioned a sizable and significant assemblage of Phyfe furniture between 1815 and 1816. Charlotte, widowed in 1846, resided with Louisa in the Fifth Avenue house for the rest of her life and bequeathed the furniture to her sister upon her death in 1872. Following that successful commission, Meier and Hagen began to undertake additional commissions. Many of New York's old families had been Phyfe clientele and had furniture that was almost 100 years old, now owned by children and even grandchildren of the original clients. Suites of furniture had been split up, broken chairs needed fixing, and additional chairs were needed to supplement a suite of Phyfe originals. Hagen and Meier found a niche and success, sometimes producing their own designs that show some of Phyfe's direct influence, and I should say in some pieces more than others. If Hagen's memoir is accurate and he wasn't introduced to Phyfe furniture until 1882, that means virtually all the Phyfe furniture produced by Meier and Hagen was made in a 6-year period between 1882 and 1888. But this is obviously something that needs a little more study. Here's another example, a chair in a private collection commissioned by the sister of President Theodore Roosevelt, Mrs. Sheffield Coles. The larger extant body of furniture that I'll discuss momentarily consists of Phyfe-style pieces made and stamped only by Hagen, who continued working after the partnership dissolved. And they weren't limiting themselves to strictly replicating Phyfe furniture. In 1885, Meier and Hagen completed this fascinating suite of breakfast furniture as part of a commission for Louis Comfort Tiffany's apartments in the Stanford White designed Charles Tiffany family residence. Designed by Tiffany, the pieces of the suite are now found in the collections of the Art Institute of Chicago and the Mark Twain Memorial. It's a fascinating suite of furniture that was the subject of a 1996 American Furniture article that I'll invite you to read by the late Milo Nave, curator emeritus at the Art Institute. And again, think about this is furniture that was made in 1885 that looks very modern even today. In 1888, by mutual consent, Meier and Hagen dissolved their partnership. I have to wonder if Meier's health was part of the consideration as he dies less than a year later. Hagen continued in the trade for another 17 years, working out of the East 26th Street shop, producing new furniture and retailing antiques, often labeling the antique pieces that he sold and adding notes about the buyer as well as any restoration undertaken on it, like this table in the Yale University Art Gallery collection. Hagen retired in 1905, turning the business over to his two sons, Henry and Frederick, who continued producing classical revival furniture into the 1930s. Here's an example of their work in the collection of the Brooklyn Museum, and a later pair of card tables. The furniture made by Hagen and Meier is now over 140 years old, so the mahogany and rosewood has mellowed with age. Much of their work is virtually indistinguishable from Phyfe originals without detailed examination. As I've discussed, Hagen stamped his pieces, but he also stamped the actual antiques that he retailed in his shop. So often when looking at a piece of furniture, it's making a determination, especially when confronted with a Hagen stamped piece. Are you looking at an Ernest Hagen made copy of a Duncan Phyfe piece, or an actual Duncan Phyfe piece later retailed in Hagen's shop and bearing his stamp? To discern an Ernest Hagen piece from Phyfe, you often have to look at physical clues like construction details. Is there a medial brace present or is it absent? Again, an earlier furniture construction characteristic, the presence of medial braces, so they're not always there. Sometimes that point where the stile and top rail are joined in some of the Hagen pieces, there's some interesting stuff going on. And one caveat I should say to only looking at construction details is that Meier and Hagen occasionally purchased unfinished furniture frames from a specialist chair maker, which they in turn carved, varnished, and caned in their own shop. So you can't just look at the construction details. As with any furniture study, sometimes a smoking gun is evidence or tools of tools or the use of materials on a piece that were not in existence in the early 19th century. Other times, it's the carving or the decorative motifs present on a piece of furniture. As Deborah Waters discussed in her 1996 article, Is It Phyfe? A Hagen and Meier card table in the New York State Museum collection, features guilloche and waterleaf carving on the legs and supports. While both are typical motifs encountered on early 19th century classical furniture, you usually don't see them combined together. Sometimes it's the quality of the relief carving on the crest that provides a good clue. In some instances, the Meier and Hagen pieces lack the crisp detailing found on the earlier Phyfe examples. And it's not just the relief carving, but I also always say, look sort of at the negative space, what's been carved out. Sometimes it looks a little rougher on the Hagen and Meier pieces than if you're looking at an actual Phyfe chair, that same area of an actual Phyfe chair. And in some cases, a bit of CSI-esque detective work is required, and a trusty UV light was necessary because it often helps detect areas where the finish has been altered. When viewed under UV light, shellac fluoresces differently than the resin varnish that was originally applied to a piece of furniture in the early 19th century. So this often gives clues about which pieces may have been altered in Hagen and Meier's shop. In at least one instance, the joints of a sofa in the Met collection actually had to be x-rayed, so they could examine construction methods, which helped to determine that the piece was a product of Hagen's bench and not a Phyfe original. Some of the most stunning Ernest Hagen pieces are these Phyfe-style sofas, especially this one in the Met collection, or this slightly smaller settee that came up at a Florida auction last spring. And Hagen's not limiting himself to seating furniture. I mean, look at this pier table. Again, upon first quick glance, it could easily be something produced by Phyfe, Lanuet, or Michael Allison. But then after you start looking at it a little closer, you start to notice some of the idiosyncrasies, the scale of some of the elements, that there's just a little bit something off about a couple of parts of it. One of my favorite Hagen pieces is this music stool that I previously lectured about. It's actually a sort of Frankenstein or a pastiche comprised of original Phyfe parts with some new added elements. When it was examined in the 1990s, there was evidence that a staining agent was used to make Hagen's newly carved elements appear antiqued and match the rest of the chair. While my lecture has largely focused on the products of Hagen and Meier's shop, I also want to acknowledge what's probably Hagen's greater contribution to the field, and that's his work as the first Phyfe scholar, something discussed in detail in the 2011 exhibit catalog for the Met's Duncan Phyfe Master Cabinet Maker in New York exhibition. Some of Hagen's work on Phyfe was published in a series of articles in the New York Sun as early as 1894. And again, one has to remember he wasn't a curator or a trained historian. In his research, he located a copy of Duncan Phyfe's will and even talked to living relatives of the cabinet maker. His son later recalled that in 1885, Hagen spent $45, which was a pretty significant sum of money, for a late 18th century New York City directory, because just so he could get a list of all the cabinet makers working in the city at that time. He wrote his widely utilized Phyfe Memorandum around 1907 and later assisted with a 1909 Met exhibit staged as part of the Hudson Fulton celebration. The exhibition included significant pieces of Phyfe furniture on loan from private collectors, as the Met did not yet have any Phyfe furniture in their collection. Hagen died at his home, 66 Halsey Street, located in the Bed-Stuy neighborhood of Brooklyn, on June 6, 1913. He was buried in Flushing Cemetery, adjacent to his wife Margaret, who had died a decade earlier. His Brooklyn Daily Eagle obituary noted his career as a cabinet maker, his descendants, and his 70-year membership in Manhattan's Trinity German Lutheran Church. Of the two partners, Hagen has received more scholarly attention. In part, it's because he's left the greater written record. His memoir has been published numerous times. Nancy McClelland included the full text of his Phyfe memorandum as an appendix in her 1939 book, Duncan Phyfe and the English Regency. And Hagen has been the focus of articles in Man Antiques Digest and American Furniture. And of course, he's a very visible presence in that 2011 Met exhibition catalog. Meier remains the more elusive partner. Unlike Hagen, he didn't leave a memoir. Census records and city directories are the main source of information. His 1889 death also means he's not enumerated in the 1890 census, which includes more information about an individual's year of immigration to the United States. His only son Gottlieb didn't follow in his footsteps as a cabinet maker, instead becoming a very successful physician. 8 years older than Hagen, Meier may have been the more experienced cabinet maker, but little is known of his biography prior to his 1849 naturalization. What further complicates this are his tendency to inconsistently use the names Johann Matthias, John Matthew, or just Matthew Meier in various historical records, and it's different in almost every one of the census or other records that I've shown you this evening. Perhaps one day we'll discover a document that will further illuminate and better illuminate his role in the partnership. I'm sure Ernest Hagen would be overjoyed to know that pieces of his furniture and those made by his sons are now in prominent museum collections like the Met, the New York State Museum, the Brooklyn Museum, and the Newark Museum, and that he's remembered both as a cabinet maker and as the first scholar of Duncan Phyfe, whose foundational work helped pave the way for future generations of Phyfe scholars. To that end, his papers, account books, and a scrapbook are found in the collections of Winterthur, the New York Historical Society, and the Museum of the City of New York. And new discoveries are continuing to be made. Just yesterday, I was looking for something else and discovered this 1926 article from a trade publication, The Upholsterer and Interior Decorator, with an image showing Hagen standing in front of the East 26th Street shop with a very clearly marked sign that I used on my title slide. This same article led to some fascinating information about a piece of furniture that I'm presently trying to pursue related to one of my favorite historical figures of the 20th century. I also, in closing, wanted to suggest that a number of sources where I've consulted for this lecture are all available online. So I encourage you to read and find those American Furniture articles. I've included links to the digitized copy of Hagen's personal experiences of an old New York cabinet maker and Winterthur, and again, that great source, that 2011 Met exhibit catalog that I believe is available for free download on the Met website. So I encourage everyone, it's great to have a copy on your computer. I have one on both my computers, not surprising. But again, thank you very much. With that, I am going to stop sharing my screen here. I am going to start my video again, and I am happy to answer questions if anybody has them. I'm going to take a sip of water here.
Grant, there's two questions in the Q&A section here. One is, to what extent, if any, was North Carolina cabinet maker Thomas Day influenced by Duncan Phyfe?
That's a good question. And I want to think. I mean, I think you can see Fyfe's influence, or a number of influences, or what am I trying to say? That, yeah, I think Duncan Phyfe definitely influenced a lot of cabinet makers at the time. I think a lot of cabinet makers are also looking at similar sources. They're looking at pattern books. They're looking at sources that are also serving as inspiration for everybody. And I just realized I probably didn't provide a very good answer for that question, but that actually requires a little lengthier of an answer. So I encourage the person, send me an email and I'll be able to provide a little deeper explanation on all of that.
Sure. And there's another question. Are the upholstered bergère chairs of the Phyfe period, or are they Hagen inventions?
That's a good question. There are a couple I know of that I believe have Phyfe attributions, but there are a number, from the Colonial Revival. And I think what's interesting, I've kind of always suspected, I think there's a number of pieces that are probably actually Hagen pieces that have been sold as Duncan Phyfe at some point in the past. I'm not saying people are doing it purposefully. I think it's just a manner of, excuse me, they've again so very closely resemble actual Phyfe pieces. And like I said, in a lot of instances, they're pastiches where Hagen has actually modified a Phyfe piece. So you sort of have these Frankenstein pieces. But yeah, I mean, it's definitely, and I think with any collection too, as the more furniture scholarship progresses, objects are reattributed all the time. I think about our own collection. where a number of pieces that were previously attributed to Phyfe have since been reattributed to Lanuet or vice versa. And I think in a number of museum collections, there's probably a couple of Hagen pieces floating around attributed or actually, identified as Phyfe. But again, thankfully, Hagen labels his pieces. And what's great about so many of those antiques that he retails is he almost writes out the provenance. He writes out what he does to it. He sometimes writes out on there what he charged or what some of the supplies and stuff cost. So it's really interesting. But like I said, I think that sort of the biggest mystery too is Meier's role, because of course Hagen is the cabinet maker who continues after Meier dies in 1889. Hagen continues until 1906, and then his sons continue well into the 1930s. So but yeah, there's just a lot of unanswered questions, and this is a project that I'm hoping to develop into something longer. And again, as I pointed out earlier in my lecture, I'm by no means the first scholar to look at Hagen. He's received a lot of scholarly attention, but I think there's still a lot of unanswered questions.
That's great. There's another question. Was Phyfe the only maker they reproduced, or were there others more or less?
No, I mean, Phyfe is really the one that's been studied because Phyfe is the one who Hagen was just amazed by. And I mean, I've also seen there's some incorrect information floating around out there that, Hagen owned a bunch of Phyfe tools. I've never seen any evidence for that. The set of tools I know of descended in the Phyfe family that was not owned by Hagen. And I think but yeah, I mean, there's evidence of them copying, like I said, copying other pieces by Herder brothers. There's that amazing, like I said, that suite from Tiffany. I encourage everyone, or that suite for Tiffany. I encourage everyone to read that article too. I mean, that's a fascinating suite of furniture that looks like something that, you could buy at Pottery Barn today or something. It looks much more modern than 1880s. But I mean, I think all of this shows their versatility as cabinet makers. I mean, you can look at those great Colonial Revival pieces that Hagen's making to see that, I mean, he's got a good hand, or, at least a combination of people in their shop have a good hand in a number of different styles of furniture.
Thanks. We got another one. You mentioned Wallace Nutting or had a photo or image of his earlier. Where are Wallace Nutting's Colonial Revival furniture pieces on display?
That is a good question. That
I know there's a strong connection between Wallace Nutting and the Webb Dean Stevens Museum.
Yes, thank you. I could not think of the institution's name. And I
Yeah.
know Historic New England, I believe, has a large collection of his photographs as well. But I mean, you can't discuss the Colonial Revival without talking about Wallace Nutting.
Yeah. I'll put in a plug for the Webb Dean Stevens
Yes.
Museum
Oh, yeah.
here in Wethersfield, Connecticut. That's a wonderful museum worth a visit.
Yes, definitely.
And are the full wing Eagle card tables like Yale and MFA Boston that are those Phyfe copies by Hagen?
I'm not.
Right. Are the full wing card tables that copied Phyfe? Oh, those are Phyfe copies. Are those by Hagen? I think that's the question.
Okay, this is another great example. Whoever's asking the question, please shoot me an email with this. And this is something where I think I know which pieces of furniture you're talking about, but want to look at a picture of it just to make sure.
Well, great. Well, those are great questions. And again, as Grant described, if you have further questions, feel free to send him or send us an email, and we'll do our best to give you an answer. We will post a copy of this lecture on our YouTube channel within the next few days, and we invite everyone to go there and review it and learn more about this. And we thank everyone for coming by this evening and spend a little bit of time with us learning about this wonderful furniture.
Thank you, everyone, and glad you could join us.
Take care.